All right, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon. Thank you so much for joining from wherever you're dialing in from. By way of introduction, my name is Lauren Phelps, a partner development manager with Palo Software across North America. I've invited a guest today. I'm going to be your host and moderator. And my guest is Eric Stragalis. Eric is the president and chief strategist at my go-to partner, really a premier partner for us across North America out of the Boston Metro. Eric has got a long history in helping organizations achieve digital transformation. He's a thought leader in this space. And there's been some interesting dialogue that I've been able to participate in with Eric. And it's because of that dialogue that I wanted to go ahead and tee up that session. So, Eric, good morning.
How you doing, Lauren? Always a pleasure to be with you.
Listen, it's been a little while. It's good to have you again. Thanks for hopping back in.
Yeah.
Let's go ahead and let's jump into it, folks. Listen, we'll be about 30 minutes today. It's going to be a general conversation. If you do have any questions, please do feel free to add them into the chat window. We're happy to take them. We're happy to have this be conversational, right? And we're happy to bring you in as part of that. That being said, Eric, I don't want to say it. I have to say it, the pandemic. A lot changed, right? Here we are, we're a year after the fact. A lot has changed. But what we can say is that the pandemic really did change organizations, right? At the time the pandemic hit, organizations locked down. We're in the Northeast, we're certainly well aware of that. And then folks had to go and start working remotely, right? As such, we saw this exponential, this massive growth, of Microsoft Teams, right? Something to 115 million daily active users. Folks were then starting to say, well, gee, now I have Teams. Can Teams become my intranet, right? Can I leverage this? If we take a step back from that, there's those organizations that we speak to that say, well, we have Teams, but we're not really leveraging it. And there's others who say, well, we have it, but we're not sure what we're going to do with it. We're not sure really what it is, right? So that's the first aspect. I want to pivot just a little bit and pick on, the sense of a changing landscape.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of people that we spoke with, and it's probably similar for you, say that, quote unquote, we have an intranet, but our employees aren't engaged in it, right? The intranet, it should be your corporate culture, it should be communication. You should be able to find documents there and the like. So you've got these almost two conflicting things now, that are impacting organizations and impacting employees.
Yeah.
Since the pandemic, right, in no time in our history have we felt the need to be more connected to one another, our friends, our family, our colleagues. We miss those. You talk about it in previous conversations, those water cooler moments, right? Coming out of a meeting and you catch up for a few minutes. We're missing all of those things. So that being said, and in this new world in which we live in, new world being hybrid, if you look at any number of reports, from a number of analysts, they're saying hybrid is the new normal. The new normal is now. You're 2 days in the office, you're 3 days home. You're 3 days in the office, you're 2 days home, right? So amongst all of this and in this changing landscape, you had picked on a term called MLP. And I'm wondering, what does that mean for us in this new hybrid world that we live in?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think, so first of all, the reality that we are starting to see sort of the light at the end of the tunnel, I think that's really exciting, right? There's lots of people are getting the vaccine, which is great. And I think people are feeling more and more comfortable coming back into the office. So there's some really good news about, the reality of work changing back in some small ways to be a little bit more normal. I know you're working from home. I'm still working from home. And I think for a lot of people, working from home will be the norm moving forward, but I think a lot of organizations are trying to sort of bring a little bit back into the office, and also smaller footprints, right? The reality is that people, organizations realized, hey, we can get away with a little less office space, lower our overhead, and and still have this working, that the business can still function when everyone is not together. So that's the reality. I think what has really happened is that over the past year, I mean, you and I both have talked about this. I've talked to a lot of organizations, a lot of folks in IT, in HR, in communications, in marketing. And overwhelmingly, what I hear is that when they first launched Teams at the beginning of the pandemic to try and just maintain that business continuity, organizations went one of two ways. They either loved it or they hated it.
Yep.
And in both cases, it's created for, I think specifically IT, a lot of challenges and a lot of headaches, right? If you loved it, you have organizations that just embraced it, adapted it very quickly, and have used it a lot. And so you end up with sprawl, right? You've got teams being created left and right, and IT's trying to sort of help people rein it in a little bit, but the reality is that there's files and chats and conversations, there's files and teams, there's files and channels, there's conversations happening in lots of different places. There's meetings and that are happening. And so, you've got a lot of different places where all of these conversations and files and documents can go. And so there's a little bit of that sprawl that's happened for organizations that loved it and adapted it and adopted it very quickly. And for the ones that didn't, that hate it, and I know that there's a lot out there. In fact, I've got a very good friend who works in the biotech industry, and every chance he gets, he reminds me how much he hates Teams. And the conversations I have with him was, why? And it's like, well, we just had to use it, and I just don't like it. It's like, well, for those organizations, by and large, the challenges there are a lack of governance, a lack of training, a lack of structure. And in both cases, IT ends up getting buried, right? Because where you love it and you use it a lot, there's sprawl, and now IT has to come in and try and control it and manage it, help people figure out where to go. It's a bad user experience too at the end of it, because
Yeah.
you have all these different places where you're storing files and documents and conversations, and people don't know where to find things. And the search in Teams is good, but it's not great, admittedly. There are ways to improve it. And so, all of these circumstances, whether you love it or hate it, IT ends up bearing the brunt. And let's be honest, IT is, you've got a limited number of resources, limited number of hours, limited manpower, and and in a lot of ways, to train an entire workforce on how to use Teams and how to use Teams better, that's just not part of the capabilities or capacity that they have. So this concept of MLP really comes in, um, because you probably heard of MVP, right? Minimally viable product.
Yep.
And the concept of an MVP is really good and valuable and important. And it's sort of, the focus is really, how do we check the boxes? How do we look at the requirements that we have in front of us and make sure that we can fulfill those requirements for those users and make sure that those users have what they need? An MLP takes a slightly different mindset, and it says, let's look at the requirements and make sure that we understand what people need, but let's also create an experience that people will love. And that's where the L comes in, right? The minimally lovable product. And the reason that we, at Stitch anyway, we really think about it in this way, minimally lovable product as opposed to minimally viable, is that checking the boxes gets you only so far. But if you check the boxes and you create an experience that your users actually love to use, now you've not only fulfilled the requirements, you've also created an experience that is going to be utilized more. And utilization is so critical. And from an IT perspective, you spend all this money, you invest in the product, you invest in Microsoft, you invest in Teams, you invest in an intranet on SharePoint, and people complain about it. They can't find what they need. They're not happy with the experience. And so utilization goes down, and now you've got a real value problem, right?
Yep.
So the point of MLP is create value, show the value of the investment quickly, prove the value quickly, and then start to build on that value as people start to use it more and find that there's a lot of value in using it. So that's what an MLP is. And that's where, what we've seen coming out of this pandemic over the last probably six months, as people really started thinking about their hybrid planning and figuring out what they're going to do, how they're going to bring people back into the office, and how they're going to change the user experience, the employee experience overall. Those are the conversations that we've been having. Is let's 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 shift the focus, let's shift the mindset to an MLP, and let's put the employee at the center, at the sort of the focal point of the digital workplace experience, so that you can drive utilization, you can drive collaboration, you can drive better efficiencies and greater efficiencies across the organization.
Nice. It makes perfect sense, and I wonder how many organizations really stop and think of it in those terms. You made a couple of really key points I just want to touch on. And the first was really utilization. And it
Mm-hmm.
sounds like putting the employee at the center of the experience would help drive that level of engagement, right? One of the concerns we always have is, well,
Yeah.
if we were going to take this approach and if we were going to do an intranet refresh, so to speak, will there be engagement? That's always the big concern. The other thing that I heard too, and you kind of picked on it a little bit, is that inflection point of communication and collaboration, right?
Mm-hmm.
Communication being the instrument, that again, that top-down communication from the CEO maybe to the staff, where you go and find documents, where you interact, where your corporate culture lives. But then there's also the collaboration aspect, right? And that's taking place in teams, where you made the point communication is more transversal, right? You can be in a meeting, you can chat, you can share documents, you can collaborate. So, with that being said, is there still a place maybe for the intranet to live within an organization, or has maybe that proverbial ship sailed at this point?
Yeah. So I think there's a lot of discussion happening out in the digital workplace, uh, uh, just among practitioners of the digital workplace, I should say, around this exact question. And there are definitely people out there that are proponents for saying, yeah, you don't need an intranet. I think that's a little short-sighted. And the reason I think that's short-sighted is that um, you know, you don't go to your you don't go to your banking website, to your bank website, to do HR work, right? These things are purpose built, and the purpose built aspect of that is really important. So from an IT perspective, and from an employee perspective, from an end user perspective, understanding that there are functionalities that exist and features that exist to really help you do your job, and knowing where to go for that, right?
Yep.
I've got a project management software that I use. I've got the ability to do chat and collaboration in Microsoft Teams. And then the intranet, I do think, is really important from a communication standpoint. I do think it's important for the cultural piece, news and information about
Yeah.
what's happening across the organization. And it's not just for huge, big conglomerate companies that have lots and lots and lots of locations and international offices. This works for small businesses too, where
Mhm.
you've got a lot of people trying to work together, aren't going to be in the same place at the same time for an extended period of time, at least for the next 2 or 3 years, and probably not for the foreseeable future.
Yeah,
Right? I mean, I don't think that remote work is ever going to go away at this point, and I think
I would
it's
agree.
there's a foothold there, and it's a pretty strong foothold. So from a sort of purpose-built perspective, I think the intranet has its place as being communicating and driving more culture and helping people find the right people to communicate with. And where Microsoft Teams is a platform and is growing and is expanding and is constantly evolving, but it's really focused on collaboration. Microsoft has said this, industry experts have all said this, and it will continue to grow as a collaboration space. Um, but, and here's the really exciting part, Lauren, bringing those two things together and really thinking about them as being enmeshed and creating a more unified view. We hear this term
Mhm.
single pane of glass a lot, but having that more unified view is really fundamentally digital workplace. I actually have a slide, and I said I wasn't going to share slides, but as we're talking about this, I feel like there's some value to it. So
Nice.
if you bear with me for a second, I think um, when we think about what the intranet is, today to Teams. I mean, if we go back, um, I think let me see if I can do this here, but going back a little bit. Uh, so this is where I think we started before Microsoft Teams came in. The intranet was really the focal point. It's where we started our day. It's where everything happened. Inside of the intranet, the goal was bring everybody here and then let them go out to the things that they need, give them access to the things that they need, the service, the self-service stuff, the information collaboration tools and communications. And Microsoft Teams was part of this, as was probably Slack and other tools. But Microsoft Teams during the pandemic has really shifted, and if, I would even say even before that. Um, this is where I think we are today, where Teams and the intranet really fit in as the focal point. And this is where that MLP process really comes into place. Because by putting the user at the center of that circle, of that digital workplace experience, where the intranet and Teams really enmesh, what you're doing is you're creating a really, really valuable digital workplace, fully digital workplace solution that brings collaboration into that central piece, right?
Yep.
That's where everyone's having conversations. That's where they're collaborating on files and documents. It's where they're sharing
Exactly.
documents and files. And just getting back to an earlier point, about just usage, people either loving or hating Teams. Um, I think a lot of their, the lack of governance, the lack of structure, the lack of understanding of the fundamental value that it provides, and the realization that over the last, I would say, 12 to 15 months, Microsoft has released more features and functionality releases for Microsoft Teams in that span of time than I think they would have done over 5 or 6 years
Yeah.
had we not had the pandemic. So
Agreed.
Microsoft Teams has like ridiculously expanded their functionality. Um, but the reality is that people are probably still pretty baseline users, and so there's a big room, there's a lot of room here, a lot of headroom to grow that functionality and to expand that functionality and to make it more usable and to really make this center piece more unified, right? Bringing the intranet
Yep.
inside of Teams, for example, so you can actually access your intranet from within Teams and never actually have to leave Teams, never have to go to a web browser to get to your intranet. Little things like that that really make a big difference and drive a more lovable experience for your employees.
You made a great point. That we've got a question that came in from the audience, so indulge me. I want us to go through
Okay,
that.
go for it.
Before we get to that question, um, the intrinsic value, right, across the Microsoft 365 stack. And I think to your point, the better a job an organization does at really unpacking all of that, the greater experience overall they're going to have. And if we pick on Teams for a moment, we have conversations with folks who maybe they use Teams for chat, right? But they haven't opened it up entirely across the organization. So, I think it's safe to encourage organizations to do that, to understand, everything and all the intrinsic value that is made available to them and understand how to make use of that, right? To your point, to drive that employee experience. So that brings us to, Eric, this question. What are examples of maybe some high value add-on to the intranet and collaboration experience that are adopted by organizations? I mean, what are
Yeah,
you
it's a great
seeing?
question. So um, I think a lot of times when we think about the intranet, we sort of think about the basic things, right? News, HR, IT access, maybe some branding from marketing. But um, we started talking at the very beginning about culture. You kind of mentioned culture, and in a world where we're not all together, I say this a lot. When we gave up our physical workplaces for our personal workspaces, we gave up a hell of a lot more than just the office conference rooms, right? We gave up having those hallway conversations that you mentioned, dropping by somebody's office, grabbing lunch with somebody, grabbing a cup of coffee with somebody, running into somebody, coming out of, a meeting, and all of those little interactions, those micro interactions that happen are where the real collaboration happens. Collaboration doesn't happen inside of a meeting room. It doesn't happen inside of a conference room where somebody is,
Exactly.
presenting something. That's information gathering. That's sharing information. status updates about where things are, but it's not where the real collaboration is happening. So, those micro interactions, I think, are where teams really exist, and sorry, where those really exist within teams now.
Yeah.
But what doesn't exist there is that sort of cultural piece, that aspect of how do we build a company culture? How do we maintain company culture? How do we keep everyone aligned to the values and the mission and the vision of the organization? And that, I think, is really important. That's where the intranet really comes in, and there's value in that. I think there's also a ton of value in sharing information from across the organization. So it could be, news from a different department that I'm not a part of,
Hmm.
that I would never hear from, right? I wouldn't know, hey, we got a big win with a new customer, and here's how we did it, right? And we couldn't have done it without the help of these other people. So there's another part of it, which is recognition,
Hmm.
recognizing the value and the effort of maybe folks that don't get a lot of visibility. Um, so there's a big piece of around recognition and rewards. The ability to integrate things like HR software. Hey, I need to know how many days I've got left on PTO. You could go to the internet and just surface that information directly from your third-party HR software. So they don't have to go to a third place to get that information. If they wanted to request PTO, you click over and go there. Um, Directory. I mean, just not everyone knows who everyone is, and people were still hiring in the middle of the pandemic. So if you're in one of those organizations that was actually growing, whether you were in biotech or some other industry, or you're starting to see that, growth starting again now, and you're hiring people, there's two values here. One is making sure everybody knows how, or everyone knows who to go to for what. So having a directory with information that brings all of that into one place, ton of value there. And lots of organizations have adopted that. And the ability to do onboarding remotely, which is
Hmm.
just so difficult. So, there's a tremendous amount of value to onboarding, leveraging both the intranet and Microsoft Teams to do that remote onboarding in a structured, organized way. And we've done that. We've built that, Lauren, with Powell Software. Um, so there's so many, and I could probably go on and on and on, and I'd be happy to have this conversation with, I don't know who asked the question, but there is a ton of opportunity there. And I think the bottom line is it's really dependent on the organization's needs. And again, I'll come back to that MLP, building an experience that your employees and your users will love, will drive greater ROI on the investment of your intranet, and it will drive greater value within the organization, which will lead them to utilize it more and will end up, driving greater opportunities to do more. So, adding more value over time, um, that the organization will undoubtedly want to use because they love it.
And I think, Eric, well answered. To your point, I think there's any, myriad of examples that you've kind of gone through. And to your point, there are certainly additional ones too. But, that kind of gives the sense of how you can create the sense of belonging, that sense of inclusivity,
Yeah.
how you can help drive engagement. I mean, all of these aspects that you're referencing here really speak exactly to that.
Hmm.
The other point that you made that is really interesting, and again, you've kind of articulated almost the value of both the intranet as well as Teams. Or as I was kind of picking on, well, gee, maybe the intranet doesn't have a place. It sounds as though the two can really coexist. So, in order to achieve this MLP, it is also part of that experience, really bringing this all together. The employee at the center of the experience, leveraging your investment in Teams, bringing your intranet in as part of that experience. Is that
Absolutely.
really, kind of where you start to see MLP take shape?
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, I think ultimately, it really comes down to the ability to not only deliver on the requirements, but to deliver a great experience.
Yep, agreed. What are maybe some other things an organization should consider, right? I'm intrigued by MLP now. What else should we consider, right, in order to really achieve that? What is the right approach?
Yeah. I mean, so from an approach standpoint, is that what you're asking?
Yeah.
Yeah, so obviously, I think everyone probably would start with discovery, and I think that's a really important piece, right? You have to spend time understanding the needs, the understanding the users, who the employees are, how you're structured as an organization, how do you work, what are the fundamental things that you're doing, and how are you utilizing information and accessing information, and then understanding the structures for that information, adding on taxonomy. How do you categorize that content so that it's searchable? How do you, what are the sort of replicable aspects of the work so that when you're creating things like a team structure with channels, when you bring people in, whether they're internal to the organization or if they're external to the organization, how do you structure that so that everyone knows where to go, so that there's some like level set expectation around, you know, if I'm coming into this team or I'm coming into this team, I know where to go for the conversations, for the files and the documents, the things that we need to do. So there's, just fundamental understanding of that. And then there's the sort of cultural piece of it. We haven't talked about gamification, but the ability to leverage gamification within your intranet to help drive some of that sort of organizational knowledge sharing and build advocacy within the organization, because let's face it, nobody's going to speak better about your organization than the people that are actually doing the work, right?
Exactly right.
So there's a tremendous value there and things that we should be thinking about. And then just making sure that the experience is, it's consumer grade. We all have devices. We've all got our phones with us, and we all have
That's right.
these high expectations of, if I'm gonna download an app and I'm gonna give it that app space on my device, and I'm gonna give that any kind of consideration, it's got to work, and it's got to work in a way that makes sense to me as an end user, and is going to create, a positive experience. I can't tell you how many apps I've deleted from my phone because I thought they were going to be great, and even though
Agreed.
they fit the bill and it was like, hey, this checks the requirements box for me of what I need to do, but it's just a terrible experience. So why am I going to keep this on my phone? And I think
Exactly.
that's the experience that we continue to see, and that's where MLP really comes in.
The gamification piece that you just touched on, there was another question that I was going to ask, and you actually were in front of that question. It was around adoption, right? Again, engagement, adoption. I think
Yeah.
gamification is a great example of that because, again, your employees are your brand ambassadors, right? I mean, I can give you an example. We've got an opening here in the U.S., right? And all of us here have interacted with the post on LinkedIn and shared it. And again, that's that feeling of inclusivity, that feeling of belonging, right? That sense of pride that you take with the organization.
Yep.
And you want to instill your employees and help instill that sense of advocacy, right? Again, brand ambassadors, because those are going to be the ones who are going to be highly engaged. And if you
Absolutely.
give them the right platform, and again, to your point earlier, putting the employee at the center of the experience,
Yeah.
right? It's one thing, I think, if you build it. It's another if you build it, but you're asking what it is you need specifically, and you're working to really solve the challenges that each individual has. Um, it's gonna create a successful kind of workplace. You're going to be able to engage the employee. They're going to become more productive, and then ultimately, the organization is going to benefit, right, because of that.
Yeah, there's one other thing that you mentioned when you were talking about adoption that I think is probably really important. Change management is such a critical aspect of any kind of implementation. Even if you already have Microsoft Teams and you already have an
Agreed.
intranet, but it's not being utilized well, right? At Stitch, we use a hashtag, use Teams better, and we do it internally too. When we're having conversations and somebody posts something or puts it in the wrong place, we kind of all help each other. We say, hey, use Teams better. And so there's a little bit of that change management that's always going to be happening, constantly happening. But at the very beginning, it's a very steep curve. And so part of MLP, part of the concept of MLP is not just, deliver a great experience and deliver an experience that checks the boxes and is a great experience. It's also about understanding that there's sometimes going to be some friction that you have to sort of, in some ways, grease the skids, right? And how do you do that in a way that enables and empowers your end users and your employees without creating a burden on IT?
Yeah.
And that is where change management really comes into play. So the concept of adoption, and I think the question, part of the question that was just asked by one of the attendees was around adoption and how do they adopt that those features. Um, some of it is going to be just conversations that have to happen within the organization. Having someone in the leadership position say, we're going to do this, we believe in this, and this is important to us. Um, the other piece is just understanding how they work and how they function, and then trying to figure out ways to improve those workflows, leveraging the tools that you have. And over time, what you see is people start adopting it much more quickly. There's that steep curve, but then it'll start to level out, even though it'll still continue to go up as new features and functionalities come out. So change management's a constant thing that we're thinking about, but it is part of that mindset, that MLP mindset.
Great point. There's another question, Eric,
Sure.
and it's one that resonates. I know for both of us. My team doesn't know what they want yet. How do I show them something quickly so they get a sense? Almost, it's really kind of that art of the possible, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Don't know what we don't know necessarily. What do we look at? What should we look at, right?
Yeah.
What maybe should we consider?
Yeah. I mean, the reality is that with enough time and energy, you can create anything, right?
Yep.
And so the we run into this a lot with implementations where we come into an organization and we say, you can't just come in and say, okay, what do you want? Because a lot of times people don't know, right? The response back
Exactly.
you often get is, well, what can you do? And then the answer is, well, we can do anything. So what do you want? And you kind of get into this cycle back and forth. This is really where we start with a more where we think about the end user first, and that's the most valuable part of the discovery process, where we say, let's not ask the question of what you want, because understandably you may not know what you want because you may not know what's possible. And don't come to us and say, well, what can you do? Because we can tell you you can do anything. So let's start with the end user first and say, let's talk about what you do today and how you work, and let's talk about how we can think about that work in a way that is going to streamline. It's really what I just finished saying about change management. How do we think about the way that they work today, their needs, their wants and desires from the work itself, and then start to bring in the tools from the digital workplace to try and make that better. So instead of trying to boil the ocean, we really look at, how can we make this work for you by creating an MLP with an MLP mindset, by creating an experience that the user loves and functions for them, meets their requirements. They will start to use it more, and then more opportunities will come out of that to continue to evolve it and make it better and make them love it more and have them use it more and find new ways to use it. And it'll just keep cycling through that.
Yep.
And that's ultimately what, I think anyone in IT wants, right? I want to show the value
Exactly.
quickly. I want to get somebody to start using it right away and see how powerful it is and how valuable it is. And then we can have better and bigger conversations.
All right. Follow-up question, and
Okay.
again, this is from the attendees. How fast is fast? Really, how long is this going to take, right, to roll out an intranet and get my organization onboarded? I'm
Yeah.
looking to do this ASAP.
Yep. So you're limited only by the capacity that you have within the organization to um, help your implementation folks understand what they need. So, the way that we tend to do this is we do a big kickoff, we get, the stakeholders in the room, we set the right goals and expectations up front. And an MLP mindset, here's what we're going to be doing and here's how we're going to be delivering it. And the initial sort of launch, the MLP, as it were, um, is not going to have everything, right? It shouldn't, because then it's too much, right? You're trying to bite off way more than you can chew. And what we've seen is implementations that start with everyone wanting everything almost never go the way that the end user wants. Actually, I will say they never end up being what the end user wants. And so people don't love it. They end up not wanting to use it. and then you're just back in square one again, where you have to rethink how you're going to implement it. So um, I think you can go as fast as a couple of weeks if you want to just kind of do the basics, right? Like set up news, set up a site for HR, set up a site for IT with some FAQs, get directory set up quickly. As long as everything's in place in the back end with your AD, you could go really, really fast. I think where things start to slow down and where you need to slow down a little bit is where you start to get into workflows and understanding how people work, and where you get into things like team structures. We can help set up those templates so that IT doesn't have to be involved in every generation of a team within Microsoft Teams, so that end users can do that if they're allowed to. But you need a little bit of governance and some taxonomical work that needs to be done there. But I would say realistically, you could get an intranet up and running in 2 weeks if you have your ducks in a row.
Yep. I would agree, right? It depends on content. Again, it does depend on what you want, but if you need something up very, very quickly, that's easy enough to achieve.
Yep.
There's another follow-up question, and it's about kind of functional areas. Should we start specifically in HR or comms or IT, or is it, new employee? And, my sense, Eric, is it's probably different for every organization, and it isn't really, it shouldn't be HR, comms, IT, et cetera, right? I think
Yep.
it varies based on the organization. And you made the point earlier that whether it's a smaller organization with 50 or a few hundred users, or it's an enterprise organization with tens, if hundreds of thousands of users, I think the challenges are still the same around engagement and around communication and around
Yep.
collaboration, right? Another follow-up question. IT often gets overlooked by people using Teams and creating lots of new teams. That is definitely what we have found in our organization. How does Powell Teams help with that?
Yeah, it's a great question. Let me just make one comment about the previous question around what
Sure.
departments or specific stakeholders we'd recommend starting with. I always recommend starting with HR, and internal comms. Why? Because that is the primary usage that people think about when they think about the intranet, right? Um, and then the ability to communicate down from the C-suite. So those are all um, really good places to start. And arguably, they will also have good content already ready to go. So
Agreed.
you can launch pretty quickly with HR and internal comms. And then you can always bring in the C-suite as well to just, bring in their voice. And that's not a difficult thing to do. So those are all really good things. And I was just reading that question in the chat. That's why I wanted to address it.
Perfect.
In terms of what Powell Teams can do. So, Microsoft Teams is a really, really, really powerful platform. It's incredibly flexible, which is good. It's also really bad if you don't have the governance and the structure and the sort of rules of the road set up. And I think that's frankly what a lot of organizations have found. I started off by saying you either
Agreed.
love Teams or you hated it. And in both cases, it creates these challenges of how users kind of the rules of the road, right? If there are no rules of the road there, if you love it and you're using it, you're probably using it for everything, and you're not probably using it very efficiently. So there's probably ways to use Teams better. Again, hashtag use Teams better. Um, or if you're not using it because you hate it, uh, it's probably because you don't know where to start. You don't have a good sense of, where to go, right? Where do I go for this? Where do I go for that? How do I find these files? I'm being tagged in conversations in a chat, but I'm also being
Yep.
tagged in conversations in a team. And where do I go for what? So you really need to have some governance. You need to have some rules of the road, having those templates where if I know that I've got replicable projects, let's say, I'm a
Exactly.
service industry or I'm in biotech or, whatever you're in, there's almost always a replicable work that you're doing, right? Otherwise, how are you in business? And so, there are ways that you can create team structures that are replicable, that end users can come in and generate without the intervention of IT resources to help do that, as long as you set up those rules of the road prior to that. And so that's really where Power Teams comes in. There's a lot of opportunity to create that structure, to create those governance rules, to define who has access to what. We had a conversation with a law firm not too long ago, and one of the requirements they had was, hey, we need to be able to allow certain people to see some of the stuff in here, but not everybody,
Yeah,
because there's legal ramifications. And we sometimes have outside counsel that has to have access. How do we control all of that? Well, Powell Teams has these rules that you can set up for these teams, and there may be one team structure that says you can allow external folks to come in, and another team structure that says no external
exactly.
folks are allowed. And so you're really empowering and enabling your employees, your end users, to do some of this uh, basic work on their own without engaging IT, without having to bring IT in, or wait for IT to to close out a ticket, or to even generate a ticket, right? So
Exactly. Oh, exactly. Well said, right? I mean, I'll sum it up. We saw kind of two key critical areas. It's user experience and it's governance, right? And we help really in both regards.
yeah.
With that delve like tile approach, it's easier for folks to drive adoption because the experience is better. And then to the point you made, Eric, around sprawl, naming convention, approval workflows, et cetera. There's ways that you can go ahead and mitigate. What we have found is organizations that let it run in the proverbial wild,
Mm-hmm.
they go from tens to hundreds, if not thousands of teams almost overnight, right? And we see it happening, time and time again.
Yeah.
To the audience, great questions. There is another one that's come in. We're going to go ahead and wrap up after this last question, though. The final question, Eric, is how do I convince management that MLP is not just a buzzword?
That's a
That's
good
that's a
question.
that's,
You know what
that's
I
a
would
good
say?
question.
I would say, um, I think the way you convince them is to say that um, the opportunity cost of not putting the users, our employees first, and creating an employee-centric solution uh, is 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 far greater if we don't take a lovable approach, because what you're doing is you're just checking the boxes. And what you want to do is you want to check the boxes, and you want to create a great experience that is user-centric, that's employee-centric. So that's what I would say, and we've seen the value of that time and time again.
Yep, great answer.
I hope that answers
Eric,
it.
listen, I want to thank you. Enjoyed the chat. To the audience, great questions. Love the fact that we had the opportunity to kind of go through this stuff live. So certainly appreciate it. To kind of wrap it all up, what I've learned, Eric, around NLP is it's really about helping employees and organizations stay connected. It's the culture, it's the sense of well-being, and we picked on inclusivity a little bit. The success too of the platform is going to contribute to the well-being of the employee, right? And to your point, if you're putting the employee at the center of that experience, you're really helping to, ensure mutual success, both for the employee and for the organization.
That's
So
right.
that was certainly my takeaway. Again, great topic. What was fully convinced it would resonate. Seems as though it did. We had some great questions, great interaction. To those of you out there who want to continue the conversation, feel free to reach out either to Eric or to myself. We're certainly happy to sit down on a one-on-one basis and have these conversations with you.
Yeah, we
Most
should we should.
importantly,
Oh, go
go
ahead.
ahead.
Go ahead, Lauren.
No, I was just going to say, and actually I just lost my train of thought. We didn't put our contact information out there. Um, that's one thing we did not do.
Yeah, I just realized that too.
I just realized
I
that
did.
too.
What I was, well, we can reach out to everyone, and we'll certainly send an email follow up with
There
a
you go.
with the recording, and we'll share that then. We should probably mention that we are starting a podcast, and we will be having more conversations just like this in a podcast format with Lauren and myself, and we'll be having other folks join as well. And so we'll stay tuned for that, because that should be coming out in the next couple months, right?
Absolutely great point. And the other thing too is, as we start that endeavor, just like today, we're happy to take kind of input of topics maybe that you would like to hear,
Yeah.
a conversation and discussion around. Today, for me, I wanted to share it because I've seen it resonate. I've seen that kind of light bulb moment when we're going in
Yeah.
and doing discovery, and they say, and as soon as you say MLP, it's that inflection point. That's exactly what I'm looking for, right? That's exactly what I believe the organization needs. So I did feel, as though it would be a worthwhile conversation again, based on the interaction. Looks like it was. So, Eric, again, appreciate it. Always enjoy the conversation.
Always a
And
pleasure, Lauren.
I'll look forward to catching you on the podcast.
Me too. Can't wait to
All
do
right,
that.
everyone. Take
Take
care,
care,
everyone.
everyone.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you. Bye bye.